Thank you for sitting down with me to hash out this little property quandary. We both care about liberty and prosperity, but I think we see land ownership very errantly. To kick things I believe land is a common inheritance of all humanity. No individual created the earth, so claiming a patch of land as exclusively mine forever is ethically dubious unless the community is compensated. In short, private land ownership without sharing its value strikes me as appropriating something that rightfully belongs to everyone.
And I appreciate the chance to debate this, truly. I come from a tradition that sees private property as the cornerstone of civilization, land included. To me, claiming and mixing your labor with land, homesteading it, makes it yours by right. It's quite natural. Throughout history, those who secured and stewarded land became its owners. Far from being theft, I view that as the foundation of social order. Hierarchies of land ownership, call it feudalism if you like, I call it an organic hierarchy, have provided stability and stewardship for communities. Landlords, in my view, can be seen as stewards of civilization, investing in and caring for the land, managing its use, and yes, collecting rent in return.
Sure, property rights and things you produce are essential. If you bake a loaf of bread or build a house, it's yours, you earned it. But land is different. No one produced land. The earth was here before us all. You mentioned homesteading, mixing labor with land, like clearing a field, which is Lockean theory. Locke also wrote that the earth is originally common to all men. One can appropriate from the commons only if there is enough and as good left in common for others. That proviso is important. In today's world, there is no enough and as good land left for others. Every acre is owned by someone or the state. So by Lockean ethics, simply claiming land without compensating others fails the fairness test. Why should a mere arrival or the first user get to hog a resource nature provided for everyone? If one castaway, call him Crusoe, lands on an island and claims the whole thing, then when Friday arrives, must Friday really pay rent to Crusoe just to live on the island both found? It seems absurdly unjust. Crusoe didn't create the island.
But Crusoe improved the island perhaps. Say he cleared some fields, built shelters. Those improvements are his, no? And if Friday shows up, he's benefiting from what Crusoe built, and from Crusoe securing the island from wild animals or other threats. More generally, the first user of land does perform a service by making it usable. Mixing labor with land, farming it, fencing it, building on it, is what gives land its value in the first place. Even raw land that seems unworked often has had some improvement paths cleared, soil drained, etc. by someone. So, I'd argue the land's value is deeply tied to labor. The notion that land is just there and value falls from the sky ignores that human action is what makes land productive. If Crusoe hadn't labored, Friday might find the island far less hospitable. Therefore, it's natural justice that Crusoe or any homesteader can claim land as property by being the first to put it to good use.
I agree that improvements belong to the improver. If you build a house or fence, that structure is yours. Georgists don't want to seize anyone's house or barn. The proposal is that the value of the land itself, separate from what you've built, should belong to the community. In practice, that means you'd pay a land value tax (LVT) or ground rent to society for the privilege of exclusive use. But anything you create on the land, your crops, buildings, etc., remains 100% yours, untaxed. So Crusoe's cabin and garden produce are his, but if a town grows around him raising the land value, he owes the community for that now prime location. I have to stress, land value mostly comes from nature and society, not individual effort. A patch of Manhattan is astronomically valuable, while identical acreage in the desert is not. The difference is NYC's 8 million people and infrastructure, not anything the Manhattan title holder did personally. As John Stuart Mill quipped, landlords grow rich in their sleep without working, risking, or economizing. They wake up to higher land prices because the community around them prospered. Why should the landowner pocket that unearned gain? Better to recirculate it for public benefit.
You say, privilege of exclusive use, as if owning land were a gift from society. I see it as a right earned by effort, or by valid transfer from a previous owner. If Manhattan land is valuable, it's because countless individuals freely came together there to trade and build, including landowners taking risks to assemble and develop plots. Yes, the community adds value, but it does so through voluntary market interactions, not by some collective intention. And even if land value rises in your sleep, so what? Luck and market forces play a role in all property. If I buy stock in a company and its value soars because the whole industry grew, I gain unearned wealth too. Do I owe society a special tax for that? If I simply happen to own a rare painting that suddenly triples in value due to art market trends, should that gain belong to the public? I don't think so. Owning something means you benefit from its rise and suffer its fall. Land can lose value too. For example, Detroit real estate crashing when the city declined. Your philosophy seems to carve out an exception in property rights just to redistribute gains you consider unearned. That feels arbitrary and frankly anti-libertarian, my friend. You identify as a libertarian, yet here you are advocating a hefty tax and a communal claim on an individual's property.
I get the libertarian alarm bells, I do, but I see LVT as different from typical taxation. Taxing wages or sales penalizes productive effort and exchange, truly a theft of what one creates. Taxing land value is more like reclaiming value that society creates. You mentioned stock gains and art, but land is fundamentally different from other assets because nobody made it, and it's not replicable. Also, land is essential for life. You can avoid buying stock or art, but you can't avoid needing space on Earth. If all land is privately owned, those born with nothing must pay landlords just to exist somewhere. It's as if a few people put a fence around the world and charge rent to the rest for stepping outside their mother's womb. That scenario strikes me as a massive infringement on equal freedom. LVT is a remedy for that. It ensures that while people can hold land, they compensate others for excluding them. It's paying rent to the community, rather than making everyone else pay rent to you.
So instead of private landlords, you'd make society the universal landlord, and the individual is a tenant who pays LVT as rent. That sounds suspiciously like the government or the people, owning all land and just leasing it out. How is that not de facto socialism or feudalism of a different sort, with the state as the high lord? Smirks, you accuse me of wanting to return to lords and serfs, but I see Georgism as turning the government into the biggest landlord of all, demanding rent from everyone under threat of confiscation. At least private landlords can't take all the land. There's competition, you can move. But if the state claims every acre's rent, you have nowhere to escape that power. Historically, whenever regimes said land belongs to the people, it ended in authoritarian control.
Touché, but I'm not advocating Soviet-style state farming or some centralized bureaucracy telling you how to use your land. Under Georgism, individuals still own or lease their plots, free to use or trade them as they wish, with one obligation: pay the LVT. The government's role is only to collect the rent and ideally redistribute it or fund public goods. Think of it this way. Right now, private landowners effectively tax everyone else by charging rent for access to locations. I'd rather have the community capture that value and, for instance, abolish taxes on labor and business. Fun fact, even Milton Friedman, no fan of big government, called land tax the least bad tax because it doesn't distort incentives. If we use LVT revenue to eliminate income tax, sales tax, etc., individuals actually gain freedom in the productive part of their lives. It's a shift from taxing productive work to taxing monopoly privilege. Land ownership sans LVT is a monopoly. You monopolize that location. My philosophy says, fine, hold that monopoly if you want, but compensate society for whatever excess value that monopoly gives you. That's a far cry from communist land control. It's more like a public ground rent. In fact, some monarchies and feudal systems did have something similar, vassals paying rent or service to the crown for land. We just propose to spread that benefit to all people equally, rather than to a king or lord.
You almost make it sound reasonable. Almost. I agree that taxing productive work is worse in many ways, but I reject the notion that owning land is holding a monopoly privilege. If I own 10 acres, I'm not stopping others from owning their own 10 acres if available, or from negotiating with me for use. True, not everyone can have a Manhattan lot, but anyone is free to bid for it. The market allocates land to those who can use it best or value it most via the price mechanism. There's no central monopoly, it's decentralized ownership. Competition between landowners for tenants or buyers keeps things in check. The term monopoly implies one-sided power, but a landlord can't charge extortionate rent. If there are alternatives, people will go elsewhere. And if there are no alternatives because a city is that desirable, then the high rent is a natural result of demand, a signal that more housing or business space is needed. High rents spur developers to build up or new entrepreneurs to create new hubs. It's not just a pet peeve to be corrected by a tax. Meanwhile, you trust government to manage this grand redistribution? Even if LVT is theoretically efficient, in practice it means assessors valuing every parcel and politicians handling huge revenue streams. Plenty of room for error or corruption there.
I won't pretend government is perfect. Georgists often criticize government graft too. Ideally, LVT is quite transparent though. Land value can be estimated from market prices, and because land can't be hidden or moved offshore, it's harder to evade this tax than others. But let's address your other point. You say a landlord can't gouge if there are alternatives. Yet what if all the useful land in an area is taken? Historically and even now, land ownership tends to concentrate. A small elite can own vast swaths. Think of aristocrats owning most of England at one point, or corporate landlords today. If you're born landless, you have to pay someone for a space to live, almost like a private tax. You call that voluntary. Sure, you choose which landlord to pay, but pay you must. It's a power imbalance. My land value tax would break that pattern by preventing idle land hoarding. A big land baron can't just sit on acres and wait for them to appreciate, because they'd incur hefty taxes until they put the land to productive use or sell it to someone who will. That opens up access and keeps land prices more affordable, which helps aspiring owners or tenants. In effect, LVT fights land monopoly. Yes, I'll use that word, and keeps the land market fluid.
It seems you view any large ownership or profit from land as inherently unfair, but sometimes large estates are more efficient, economies of scale, long-term planning, etc. And those aristocrats you mention, for all their flaws, did often manage land across generations, arguably with a sense of duty, noblesse oblige and all that. They built communities, sponsored infrastructure, railroads, mills, etc., in more modern times on their lands. A landlord who expects his family to hold an estate for centuries might actually be a careful steward maintaining forests, investing in soil health, more so than a short-term, tax-squeezed user who might feel like just a tenant year to year under LVT. If you tax land too much, you could encourage a short-term mindset, use it frantically to cover the tax bill, or abandon it if you can't pay. You'd effectively punish patience and conservation.
Interesting point. But consider this, a land value tax encourages intensive but responsible use of land within its natural capacity. If someone is just holding prime urban lots vacant waiting for a higher price, that's wasted opportunity when others could be using that land now. LVT nudges them to either develop or sell to someone who will. For conservation lands like forests, their highest use in value terms might indeed be as conservation, parks, managed forests, etc., which could mean a lower assessed value than if it were zoned for buildings. Many Georgists actually propose land use value assessment for open space or environmental lands so they aren't overtaxed. Plus, if society deems a forest truly off limits for development, presumably the community could exempt it or own it collectively as a park. In general, I think LVT aligns the owner's incentives with the community's. You keep land only if you're deriving value equal to what society could get from it. As for aristocratic stewardship, color me skeptical. Sure, some were model landlords, but plenty of others were absentee rentiers. I'd rather not rely on the benevolence of aristocrats or landlords for public needs. I'd rather systemically ensure the public gets its due rent and can fund things like roads, schools, and yes, maybe environmental preservation for the common good.
We're wading into economics, but underlying this is an ethical divide. Is land ownership absolute or contingent on social duty? For you, it's clearly contingent. A landowner is a trustee for humanity, in a sense, who must pay dues. For me, ownership is ownership. If it's legitimately acquired, it comes with rights that shouldn't be undercut by perpetual obligation, beyond perhaps basic obligations like not polluting beyond your borders, etc. I see landowners as owing nothing involuntarily to others just by virtue of owning land. Any duties should be voluntary or arise from explicit contracts, like if you join a homeowners association, you agree to rules. You basically want an automatic lien on every property on behalf of society.
Because society does underlie the value of every property. Nobody truly survives or thrives in isolation on a patch of land without society. The roads that get you there, the peace that lets you farm instead of fend off invaders, the trade that gives your land a market value, all that is social. Even the enforcement of your property deed is done by a legal framework, courts, police, or in libertarian case, perhaps private defense agencies. Community creates a huge portion of land's value and security, so it is only fair that community gets a portion of the reward. With LVT, we formalize that social contract. Yes, you own this land, but in exchange you give back a land rent tax so that everyone benefits from what we collectively provide. It's not personal charity, it's paying for benefits received. The landowner still has plenty of incentive to use the land well, because they keep all profit from their own improvements and enterprise. They just don't profit from what they didn't create, the land's raw value or external appreciation. Ethically, that feels like a balancing of rights. Your individual property rights balanced against others' equal right to a share of the earth.
I understand the argument, even the appeal of it. You're basically saying you didn't build that entirely, so share the gains. But this line of thought can be a slippery slope. Today it's land. Tomorrow someone says your successful business wouldn't exist without society's education system and infrastructure. So the community deserves a slice of your profits. In fact, some socialists do argue exactly that. It's a continuum of collectivist logic that I'm wary of. I prefer a principle that's clear-cut, respect property rights and the freedom of contract. And yes, rely on the wealthy or landed to voluntarily support community needs through philanthropy, investment, or negotiated agreements. Historically, many public goods were provided by private initiative or patronage by landowners, like a lord financing a village church or a philanthropist endowing libraries. Once you make it a compulsory tax, you empower the state and potentially dampen the owner's willingness to do these things on their own. Why invest in your community if any increase in land value just hikes your tax next round?
I see your concern, but I think it's overstated. LVT actually rewards productive investment. If you improve your land, build better housing or a business, your buildings and business are not taxed under true Georgism. So, you keep all the profit from those investments. If those investments incidentally raise land values, yes, your tax goes up, but presumably you're making more income from the improvement as well. And if a rising tide of development around you raises your land value without you doing anything, well, that's precisely the unearned windfall we're targeting. As for the slippery slope, I do draw a line at natural resources. Land, including natural resources like oil, minerals, spectrum, etc., is uniquely appropriate for this kind of social rent because it's not produced by human effort. I'm not saying tax successful entrepreneurs just because society helped them. I'm saying charge rent for monopolizing pieces of the commons. It's a principled distinction. In fact, I would argue Georgism strengthens property rights for labor and capital because we'd no longer need to tax those at all. Imagine keeping 100% of your wages and profits, with only landholders paying based on location value. That's more libertarian than our status quo. It's just taking the no taxation on earned income to its logical conclusion and shifting the burden where it logically belongs.
That's an interesting libertarian sales pitch for LVT, untax everything except land. However, from my perspective, even land rent is a rightful income for the owner. If I legally bought and maintain a piece of land, the rent it yields or the price appreciation is mine just as much as the yield of any investment. Slapping a 100% tax on that, as some Georgists propose, essentially nullifies my ownership. I'd become a tenant of the public. Maybe you'd set the rate lower than 100%, but any special tax on land feels punitive to property owners. It also raises practical questions. Landowners would try to pass the tax on to tenants by raising rents. You claim they can't, due to fixed supply and all, but in the short term they likely will try, and if all owners are taxed, rents across the board could go up. There could be complex effects, and I doubt it's as frictionless as theory suggests. Also, what about farmers or elderly homeowners who are land-rich, cash-poor? A heavy land tax could force them to sell family land or homes because they can't pay the tax annually. That strikes me as cruel and disruptive to communities.
These implementation challenges are real, and in practice, Georgists often support gradual or partial LVT to avoid shocks. But let's unpack a bit. Can landlords pass on the tax? In theory, a land value tax mostly comes out of land prices, not ongoing rents, in the long run. If buyers and investors know the land is taxed, they'll pay less for it up front, which means the current owner effectively bears the cost in a reduced asset value. Tenants would pay rent based on what the land is worth after tax. Empirical evidence from places with LVT or higher property taxes supports this. To some extent, land prices tend to adjust downward. Regardless, even if some cost is passed on, the tenants are no worse off than before they were paying that rent anyway. Just now, a portion goes to public revenue rather than the landlord's pocket. And ideally, the tenants benefit because that public revenue is used to cut other taxes or improve services. As for the land-rich, cash-poor scenario, typically those cases can be handled with deferrals or exemptions. Many jurisdictions with property tax let seniors defer payment until the property is sold, etc. But fundamentally, if someone sits on extremely valuable land and can't make enough use of it to pay a modest percentage tax, that's a sign the land could be put to better use by someone else. It sounds harsh, but remember, they wouldn't have that dilemma if not for the high land value created by the surrounding community. Why should they exclusively benefit from that community-created value if they choose not to utilize it? Say, a farmer on land now worth millions as suburbs encroach. LVT encourages a transition, perhaps selling to developers who will use it to house many families, while the farmer can take the proceeds and move to cheaper land. The community gets housing, the farmer gets compensated, and through LVT the public gets revenue to build, say, a new school for that neighborhood. Everyone ultimately benefits, rather than freezing a prime location in inefficient use.
I see your logic, though I'm not fully convinced everyone benefits. The displaced owner might not think so. You treat land almost as if it's on permanent lease from society, which is, fundamentally, where we disagree. To me, if it's your land, it's not society's business, so long as you're not harming others. You mention community-created value a lot. But isn't that just another way of saying external circumstances affect wealth? True, but by that reasoning, should homeowners pay a tax if their neighborhood gets safer due to others' actions? Or should tech entrepreneurs pay a special tax because general innovation ecosystem boosted their company's value? We generally say no. Gains and losses fall where they may in a free system. It's not perfectly fair, in a cosmic sense, but it incentivizes people to invest and take risks because they keep the upside. Land is no different in my view.
The difference, again, is land is a finite commons at root. You keep coming back to absolute property rights. I'm carving out land and natural resources as a shared inheritance. Think of it as each of us being a shareholder in the giant gift that is Earth. When one shareholder exclusively uses part of the common asset, they owe the other shareholders a dividend. That's the LVT. It's not about punishing success or arbitrarily slicing up every gain. It's about that unique initial endowment of nature that we all should have a stake in. You worry about government overreach. I worry about unbridled private concentrated power, which large land ownership confers. You mentioned you prefer benevolent aristocrats or voluntary charity to look after the less fortunate or the public needs. History hasn't been too kind to that approach. Yes, some nobles were generous, but others were despots. And even a good-hearted landlord is still an unelected power. I'm basically saying power to the people. In the most literal sense, the people collectively hold ultimate title to land, while individuals manage and use parcels and pay the common rent. It's a kind of partnership, private enterprise and public ownership, sharing the benefits.
And you call me feudal? You just described something quite akin to the old feudal notion that all land is the king's or the people's, and nobody has a allodial title except the sovereign. In effect, you want to be the new sovereign, the people replacing the king. I, on the other hand, argue for truly allodial property for individuals, full ownership with no overlord. Yes, that can lead to hierarchies. Some end up owning more land, others become tenants. But those hierarchies form through freedom and agreement, not by top-down design. And frankly, hierarchy itself isn't a bad thing in my philosophy. I embrace that society will have elites, natural elites, hopefully earned by merit or at least by the maintenance of wealth, A landlord who mismanages his estates will lose tenants or see his land value drop. A competent landlord attracts people to his domain. In a way, people vote with their feet under a system of private land domains. If a landlord or community is oppressive, people can leave for a better run estate or a freer city. That's the kind of decentralized order I find appealing. Something neo-reactionary thinkers call patchwork, many small sovereignties competing and people free to choose among them. Your system, by contrast, envisions a single tax system covering everyone and presumably a uniform policy decided democratically. The tyranny of the majority could be worse than a local lord's whims.
There's some romance in that patchwork vision, I admit. But the freedom to vote with your feet is not very meaningful if every patch has a landlord charging you rent to exist. It's like saying you can choose your feudal lord, but you will have one regardless. I'd rather each person inherently have a stake in the land, not have to swear fealty to a private owner for a place to live. And your model doesn't really account for the dispossessed who can't afford any patch. They become basically serfs or beggars. Under Georgism, at least everyone effectively gets a share of the land value revenue, either through public services or a citizen's dividend. Some propose the LVT be distributed UBI style. So everyone benefits from land, even if they don't own a parcel personally. That's more egalitarian, yes, and I think that's a good thing, equality of basic opportunity also. You trust natural elites and market forces to check bad landlords. I'm more skeptical because leaving means upheaval for people, not so easy to uproot your life. And if all land is owned, where do you go? In your extreme vision, every piece of earth is someone's fiefdom, so any place you go, you'll be under some lord or other. Love it or leave it doesn't work globally if there's nowhere unknown to escape to.
Perhaps I paint a stark picture, but essentially yes, all valuable resources would be owned by someone or some group in a fully realized private property society. But ownership can be fluid, people sell, new owners rise, etc. And it's not necessarily oppressive. If owners want to attract residents or investors, they'll offer good conditions. Think of how companies compete for employees with perks. In a patchwork of privately governed communities, they'd compete for citizens. Some might offer low rents or rights protections to entice people. Others might cater to different preferences. Some communities might be ultra-libertarian, others religiously oriented, etc. People sort themselves where they fit, and property owners set the tone. It's kind of like medieval principalities meets free market. You call it neo-feudal as a jab, but I see it as many voluntary micro-societies rather than one Leviathan state.
I understand the thought experiment, but voluntary is doing a lot of work there. If you're born into a poor family, your choices might be very constrained. The freedom to exit is hollow if you can't afford the entry fee elsewhere. That's why I'm harping on everyone having at least some claim to land wealth, a dividend or public service, to empower their choices. Also, your system has no remedy if an owner decides to be very illiberal on his land, aside from people leaving, which as I said can be hard. He could ban certain speech or behaviors, enforce draconian rules, essentially a private tyrant. You might be okay with that as his right on his property. I'm not. I believe in some baseline of rights that shouldn't be subject to a landlord's whims. Ironically, you might end up with what amounts to governments anyway, property owners acting as governments. The difference is, they're not accountable to citizens except by exit. I'd rather have a system where citizens are all stakeholders by default, like collecting land rent gives everyone skin in the game. Then we use democratic processes to set policies which, while imperfect, at least notionally count everyone equally rather than by acreage owned.
And here we come to a philosophical crux. You have more faith in democracy and egalitarian arrangements, and I have more faith in ordered liberty and hierarchies emerging from property rights. I see the historical record of democracies seizing property or overtaxing, and I shudder. You see the record of aristocrats and landlords abusing peasants, and you shudder. Perhaps we're both trying to avoid different dystopias.
That's a fair way to put it. I fear a dystopia of a landless underclass forever paying rent to a landholding elite, a new feudal age of extreme inequality where birth or luck determines your access to the earth. You fear a dystopia of overbearing collectivism where individual initiative is punished and bureaucrats dictate property use.
Exactly. And thus we prescribe opposite cures. I argue for absolute property rights as a shield against tyranny, including the tyranny of the majority. In my view, if you own something outright, neither kings nor voters should take it away or tell you how to use it, barring harm to others. Land is no exception. The ethics to me are straightforward. Land ownership is not theft. It's a just reward for someone's or their ancestors' initiative to claim and cultivate it, or purchase it from someone who did. Sweeping that aside because it doesn't fit an ideal of equal inheritance undermines the sanctity of all property.
I hold that land as a special case. All men have equal right to the earth, as the saying goes. If we don't acknowledge that, we get a subtle form of tyranny of its own, the tyranny of monopoly. Yes, majority can be tyrannical, but so can concentrated minority power. Landlords controlling who gets to use land, at what price, that's serious power. I'm not against all hierarchy or earned advantage, but land ownership is too fundamental to leave unchecked. Ethically, I see charging rent on land as the morally right thing. It's rent on behalf of the people, rather than rent extracted from the people. I recall a line from Tom Paine, or maybe Henry George, The earth is the common property of the human race. We can allow private possession for convenience, but the benefits of land rent should flow to all, not just title holders.
And I suspect we'll continue to disagree on that moral premise. Grins, you're quoting Paine. I could quote Burke or Rothbard in return, but I think we've laid out our cases pretty thoroughly.
Indeed. To sum up my side, land value tax is, I contend, the fairest economic approach, because it puts into practice the idea that while you own what you create, what nature provides belongs equally to all. It promotes efficient land use, curtails speculative excess, and funds the community without hampering enterprise. Private land ownership without societal compensation is ethically questionable, not outright theft in a rhetorical sense perhaps, but a kind of unjust enrichment that a just society would rectify.
And my summary, private land ownership is natural and essential. It may lead to hierarchies of owners and renters, but those hierarchies reflect voluntary order and stewardship. The attempt to treat land as common property through an LVT or similar is, to me, an infringement on rightful property and a step toward collectivism. Economically, I believe free markets in land, buying, selling, renting, lead to the best use of land, and any heavy tax or social engineering will backfire with inefficiencies or unintended consequences. Landlords, in a free system, have incentives to care for their land and contribute to growth. They aren't mere parasites as you paint them. And morally, I reject a claim that simply owning land compels an owner to pay an indefinite debt to society.
Well, we may not convince each other, but I appreciate the candid, spirited exchange. We managed to debate property rights, philosophy, and economics without descending into incivility or, dare I say, calling for each other's heads on a pike.
Likewise, it's refreshing to clash ideologies with civility. Despite our jabs, I recognize your position comes from a genuine concern for justice and prosperity.
And I know yours comes from a genuine commitment to liberty and social order. We just define those differently when it comes to land.
If nothing else, maybe we've clarified the key trade-offs for anyone listening in: common inheritance versus exclusive right, equality versus hierarchy, tax versus property absolutism. It's a fascinating debate that goes back centuries. Perhaps it will continue for centuries more.
Hopefully with as much wit and goodwill as today. Until next time, then?
Until next time. Cheers to lively debate on common ground, ironically enough.